we'll get started. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining us today. As you can see, we're connecting from all over the US and the world. We have our colleagues in Albania and Montenegro, and then we have volunteers who are calling in from different parts of the US. I'm in Connecticut, where I'm doing this call. And I'll just share that my wife and I are teleworking from the same room, so if you ever hear any background voice, that's who that is. But it's really nice to connect with everybody. Of course, please feel free to chime in with any questions, and thoughts, any experience, because what we're talking about today is taken and adapted from our COS conference, where we talk about a number of different things. And actually, over the past couple of weeks, we've been able to go through a bit of our COS conference content. We did, in bits and pieces, we talked about administration, we talked about medical, we talked about sort of processing some of the experience. We had some Zoom calls with A22s, with A21s. But we also talk about transitioning and the next steps in terms of career. And so starting today and next week and the week after, we're going to be putting some of these sessions together virtually, hopefully to support you in your transition. And I'll just say on a lot of these topics, the way that we will flow is I will be walking us through, some content, some big higher level content. But when it comes to resumes or it comes to interviews in a couple of weeks, I have my experiences, but I encourage others to share their experiences, because how each career progresses is unique. So I encourage anyone to jump in with thoughts, with comments, with questions, to make this as robust of a conversation as possible. So with that, we are talking today about resumes. And as I said, in a moment, I am going to be sharing my screen. And I will do that now. So you should be seeing my screen at that point. Could I see a few thumbs up if this has worked correctly? Thank you. I think still navigating all these different digital platforms and making sure that doing it correctly. So today we're talking about writing your resume, and there's a lot of information out there about writing resumes, and likely since probably even before Peace Corps, you have been you've been tweaking your resume. You had to submit one to apply to be a volunteer. If you're looking for work currently, you've had to update it. I'll say that when it comes to resumes, there are a lot of opinions. There's a lot of thoughts out there. I want to talk about some of the basics of writing a resume, but I would love, as we progress, for people to chime in with some of their thoughts of what maybe they've experienced. I know on this call, there's people who have hired, who have been hired, who have written resumes, who have reviewed resumes. So would love, as we continue, to hear from people. We're going to talk about, we're going to go over a couple of main things. We're going to talk about resumes, and then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about cover letters as well as have time for questions at the end. And so we're going to talk about what a resume is, talk about some tips for a resume, go over a sample resume, as well as go over some myths, and sort of progress from there. So probably you know this, but a resume is 1 to 2 pages. Talks about your experiences, your qualifications, and your achievements. The goal is to capture the reader's interest. Most resumes only get about 20 or 30 seconds scanned by the reader, and I would say that scan is the entrance way to a deeper look, and to draw people in, and should have enough impact to grab the attention of the reader. So to make it easy for things to jump out to capture people's attention. And I think a lot of us know this, because we're in this field, but you never get a second chance to create a first impression. And for the purposes of job searching, for the purposes of resume writing, oftentimes the resume is the first impression that your potential employer will have of you. And for better or worse, oftentimes will extend throughout the interview process. And I know I've been involved in rounds of hiring where the format of someone's resume, or a resume that didn't match how someone interviewed, will sometimes continue to come up, and continue to that impression that is made can last. And so making sure that what you're doing does that as well as possible. So a couple of tips. I want to run through some tips. There are more than these tips, but I want to run through a couple of things. So the first is to give specific dates. And I came up with these tips through some of my own experience, and then also looking through different employment websites, and reading through what recruiters are saying these days, and what other hiring officials are saying these days. But specific dates, giving specific dates to avoid confusion. And so usually month and year is sufficient. So for volunteer service, January 2018, January 2019 to March of 2020 is usually sufficient. But write it out to avoid confusion. So write out the word January, write out the word March, so as not to avoid confusion, because I think, as we all know, dates are written differently in different parts of the world, and you wouldn't want to have confusion based on something so small as that, or have someone, if you give pause to your resume for something as small as that. Avoiding inconsistencies. When you submit an application, you are going to have your application package, which is most commonly a LinkedIn profile, or most commonly a resume and a cover letter. But LinkedIn is also a very common platform these days, as well as other other sources that might be out there. So making sure that any information that's available about you lines up with what's on your resume. So if you say on your LinkedIn profile that you were a Peace Corps volunteer, but then write somewhere else that you were a Peace Corps volunteer associate, not sure why one would do that, but those little things can add to confusion. Delete irrelevant work. Making sure that the resume you submit is relevant to your work, the work that you are seeking. Some industries will want people to go as far back as possible, but I think as you progress through your profession, as you get more professional experience, you can start to drop off some of maybe experiences you may have had growing up. If you had a summer position, if you learned a skill in those summer positions, if you, for example, one summer you worked somewhere and gained specific skills, maybe you worked at a theme park and learned some mechanic skills in your position, you might be able to list it, but in general, as you get further away, feel free to drop off irrelevant experience. And bold the correct information. And employers are more interested in what you did rather than where you did it. And actually, just last night, as I was going through this, I looked at my own resume and realized that I had the organizations that I worked for, which is mostly Peace Corps, bolded and underlined. And my wife was sitting next to me, and she said, "Why are you bolding and underlining Peace Corps instead of, Director of Programming and Training or Country Desk Officer?" And I said, "Well, that's the way I've had it for a while, so I haven't changed that formatting for a while." And she pointed this out, and this is also, I think, really strong advice that employers are interested in what you did, not as interested in where you did it. I think it should be noted that you worked for Peace Corps. A couple of rare exceptions might be that if you work for a very high-profile organization, but for the most part, focusing on the positions, the specific positions that you held. A few more. Don't bury the lead. List your professional experience at the top of your resume. Don't bury the lead. Don't let employers have to search to find out what qualifies you for a position. So if you are applying for a teaching position and you were a TEFL volunteer, putting that experience at the top, front and center, along with any other teaching experience that you have, and not letting employers search for your skills. Skipping hobbies, unless your hobby is relevant to the position. Generally, I would suggest saving that space for additional details for your skills and experience. Every line on a resume counts. And so saving that space for talking about what qualifies you for the job. Use an easily readable font. 10 is as small as you want to go. In my honest opinion, I feel like 10 is probably too small. Size 11, size 12 is what I would suggest. And use a non-controversial font. I think would be another, along with that. And non-controversial fonts off the top of my head include Times New Roman, Calibri are two that jump to mind. But using a font that is going to not raise any eyebrows. A common example would be Comic Sans of a font that might raise eyebrows. Generally, there's always exceptions to every tip and every rule. There might be an industry out there where Comic Sans is widely acceptable. Follow the application instructions. This sounds obvious, but a lot of times job announcements will ask for specific things, and they'll ask you to, in your cover letter to address specific questions, or in your resume to put things in a certain place. And so making sure to read through the job announcement in full and follow those instructions. A recruiter or a hiring manager who knows that applicants were asked to describe their most meaningful experience in the past 2 years, a cover letter that doesn't have that question answered, someone's going to know that someone's just sending out resumes. They're not interested. They're not as committed to this position. So making sure you're reading through job announcements in full. All right, the last two, use an easy to follow file name. Make it easy for your application. If someone is saving resumes onto a folder, a lot of times in offices, applications will be received by one person and then possibly read by another. Someone on the administrative or human resources team will receive the applications, organize them, and then put them in a folder. Make it easy for that to happen. Making sure your name is visible, the name of the organization that you're applying for, they may change it themselves. But avoiding naming conventions, that says, resume 01, something that might, lead to confusion. Don't copy and paste the job description into your resume. And I have heard friends of mine say that the best way to get a federal job is to take the job description and put it into your resume and then submit that resume for a federal job so that the keyword searches get hit when the computer does the scanning. And I remember when I was a supervisory desk officer, someone had submitted a 52-page resume with nothing but the job description, copy and pasted over and over again. And as a result, they got a very high score from the computer, and they were passed over from HR. And the moment I looked at that resume, I knew I had no interest in interviewing or talking to this person because they had not taken the actual time to craft a resume. So using keywords is important, and tailoring your resume to a position is important. If a position calls for specific skills and you have those, making sure you identify that in the resume. But ultimately, when it comes to getting a job, a human being is going to be reviewing you as a candidate and making sure you put that best foot forward. And then lastly, don't lie on your resume. Seems obvious. Don't be tempted. There was actually, last night and yesterday and over the past couple of days that I've been working on this, I found a number of articles that talked about why not to lie on your resume, which surprised me because, as I said, it seems obvious, but clearly in the industry, this is something that comes up. So I saw a comment come through, or a question come through. And I will, if anyone hasn't muted the microphone, please do so. And as I said, it is possible that some background noise might be coming from my end, and if that's the case, I apologize. As my wife and I work in this confined space. So, all right. Okay. So I was able to pull up a sample resume, and I hope you are able to see it on your screen. And it's a sample resume, and so some of the specifics aren't filled in. But having reviewed quite a number of resumes over the years, have seen resumes that look almost exactly like this, where you take one look at it, and so I'm sort of curious. So after seeing some of those tips, is there anything that jumps out to you about this resume that catches your attention or not? So unfortunately, I'm not able to make it appear as full screen. Unfortunately, with the way that the presentation is put together. So I see grammar check. So Hillary wrote in with a grammar check. So yeah, so that immediately catches your eye that there were mistakes somewhere in here, and even if grammatically, even if if in your resume you're working, and sometimes I've seen this with Peace Corps resumes where people are using words from different languages or using experiences that's specific, just that jumps out, and it immediately sort of says this resume has errors that even the computer is checking. And I think along with that is the underlining of month and year. Yes, Stephen points out that the stated objective is unsubstantial and non-specific. And I'll read that out. Obtain a position as a team player in a people-oriented organization where I can maximize my business experience in a challenging environment. And I think when you hear that, what have you learned about the person? What have you learned about the person who's applying? It doesn't convey any specific meaning. Marcy points out that it's written too tight. It's hard to read, and I think along with it being written very tightly and it's hard to read, it also leaves a lot of awkward space as well. So it's cramped, but seemingly unnecessary. And yes, there's no dates specified, as it is a sample. So let's see. I see a couple of other comments. Read the list of tasks, not so much what the individual accomplished. Exactly. There's a number of things. You've caught a lot of them. Also, a lot of these skills could be communicated within the experience, etc. So let me jump back to here. Just out of curiosity, as I'm sharing on screen, a moment ago I had the chat box pulled up. Were participants able to see the chat box? Yes. Thank you. With the way Zoom shares screens, sometimes I'm not always sure if everything is being shared or if parts of it. So you've pointed out almost all of these things. I think, up here at the top, I think this is another, one we didn't specifically catch, but the way that this resume is set up, it has the name over here in the corner. I mean, you want to make it easy to know who you are, why you want the job, and what you've done to be qualified for that job. I think, as Stephen said, the objective was not specific. It didn't convey anything. It talks about wanting a job. I think if the only objective of submitting the resume is to get the job, you don't need to put the objective. By submitting the resume, you've said, I want this job. Generally, as I said, don't bury the lead. Put your experience up top. Also, when putting together, your list of skills, think about what skills really need to be highlighted. And when I think about these, I think about some of these could be integrated into your experience, and then also, I think about the necessity of putting Microsoft Office, for example, on a resume. Microsoft Office is a pretty standard tool these days, and I think just about anyone who's competing for work is going to have those skills. Obviously, Microsoft Office is a very powerful package, and the ability to use Excel to do certain types of analysis. If there's certain tools in Excel or certain things within Microsoft Office that make you qualified to do that job, it's worth listing. But simply, the general Microsoft Office skills don't always have to be utilizing the tools within Office can be highlighted. So if you've used Excel to do macros, or if you, you know, mail merge, things like that, the way the systems integrate with one another, that those sorts of those tools or skills can be highlighted. Also, we pointed out the way that the font was cramped. It's kind of hard when you first glance at this. It's I know it's a sample resume, but it's kind of challenging to get a sense of what's this person bringing to the table. Also, inconsistencies. Making sure you catch spaces, making sure that you catch any grammar mistakes, consistency in the way that you identify where your former work was. Generally, you don't have to put company, street, address, and state. Generally, state, city and state is sufficient, or city and country if you have overseas experience, which a lot of you do, all of you do. And just, cleaning up these inconsistencies. And a lot of these are small. Nothing about the way a resume is formatted changes who you are as a candidate, as a person. But if we go back to that first slide and we think about, the competitiveness of the workforce, the fact that resumes are often scanned, I think part of the goal in structuring a resume is making sure that there's no reason for someone to glance at it and put it into the discarded pile. You want to have it structured in such a way that people look at it and it's easy to read and it draws people in. And even though this is just a sample, you can see how just to the eye it's not particularly pleasing, and it doesn't make you want to read more. And so here is a template that has a lot of these dressed, and you can see just much more naturally how it flows. And so you can see, right away. And so, recruiters are going to look for different things first. But right away, I think you can see on a sample like this, the way that, it's very clear who is it? Who is this person? Here's their job experience. It's nicely laid out. You can see who they worked for, what they did, when they were there, even spacing, things like that. And how even though they used more of the page, I didn't put these side by side, but even though they used more of the page, you can see that they used, the full margins, side to side, up and down, and it reads much cleaner. And so this, this sort of has a lot of those small things addressed. I don't see any spelling errors. Things are nicely formatted. This is sort of a nice one-page resume that brings the eye different places. So I'll pause for just a moment if there's any questions or thoughts. I mean, I feel like we just covered a ton of material, and I know that there's a lot of thoughts on resumes. So if there's any questions, feel free to use your mic, or if you want to put it into the chat box. I'll pause for just a moment.
I was just thinking, what would be your recommendation when it comes to sending a CV in PDF or in Word document format?
So I would love to hear what others have to say before I weigh them. And I will say that my thinking has recently changed on that, and I'll share that in just a moment. Any thoughts to Ivana's question about any thoughts to Ivana's question about PDF versus Word?
Kyle?
Yeah.
My recommendation would be PDF for a simple reason, as it can be like a different application on the receiver device, and if it's Word, you can just probably like change around the formatting. That's one simple reason for that. PDF, I think it's a more kind of a organized file that can be opened by most of the devices, or at least people have application for opening for the PDF.
Kyle?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I used to be on a hiring board at my old job, and we would always request that it was in PDF because people use different word processors. Not everyone uses just Microsoft Word. And when we open it, it'll change the formatting to fit our programs. And so if it was PDF, we could just pull up a viewer. And so that was the easiest thing for us.
I'm seeing some nodding. To that. I would agree completely. PDF tends to, it cleans a lot of things up, and I think, back to Hillary's comment about how the first resume had some grammatical mistakes underlined, or some spelling mistakes underlined in a PDF. Obviously, you're going to be reviewing your resume very closely, and those grammar mistakes won't be there, and those spelling mistakes won't be there. But on the off chance that they are, a PDF might make that harder to discover. And I think it's tough when you open up a resume and it's got those mistakes, or even when submitting a Word resume, even if they have the same Microsoft Word package that you do, if you put a word, the name of your town, the Diviak, Lynn, is likely going to show up on their computer as a misspelling. And even if yes, it's spelled correctly, if the word Lynn or Diviak or Flor shows up on your resume multiple times, it could just sort of put someone off without intentionally. And then also the software as well, and the viewer making it a lot easier. I will say that there are sometimes job descriptions will specify which platform to use, and in those cases go with what they use. Some hiring software, Microsoft Word works better because it's able to scan the document more easily, but I think as a default, PDF is a lot safer. And then Stephen, I see that you also, before I'm going to go through a couple of the comments in the chat, but you also talked about emphasizing quantifying your proficiency level and skills. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so kind of what you were talking about was like everyone has used Microsoft Office Suite to some extent, but to say that you are proficient or you're an expert or you have some kind of certification or training for like Excel, for Outlook, for whatever, that will typically be better well received than just saying, oh yeah, I have used Microsoft Office. And same for, whichever sector specific programming skills that you might need, or if you know other skills that are useful, it's always useful to say like, I'm proficient, or I have exposure, I have, whatever. And same with like, if you're going to be applying for jobs with languages, being able to say that you reached a certain level of a language than just saying, I know Albanian, but saying like I reached a level in Albanian will be much more useful for a job. And I just think that if you're going to even add skills, always try and quantify it.
I think that's good advice.
I would also echo that for the things you're putting in your resume. And just taking Peace Corps as an example, and Kyle mentioned not wanting to copy and paste out of a job description, but you also want what you accomplished in Peace Corps or any job to be very customized to you. It shouldn't be able to be copy and pasted into someone else's resume and be true. Like, and you adding numbers is really helpful. So instead of saying I conducted a business training, say how many people participated. If it was a grant writing training, you might want to say like 17 people participated and X amount of grant funds were secured from the participants in the 6 months following, or, you know, information like that is really helpful. Health education volunteers saying that they were part of the, you know, first pilot of a first ever health education national curriculum in Albania, you know, working with 17 teachers across 2 schools and supporting 798 students, you know. So adding those numbers really brings to life the information in the resume that otherwise might not jump out. And then the cover letter, and I don't know, Kyle, if you're going to talk about cover letters, but cover letters are incredibly important to really get across the storytelling, the passion you have for the job, the alignment of your skills to the organization's values, you know, and all that sort of thing. So I think the combination of a solid resume and a strong cover letter that's customized to the organization are really powerful.
Yeah, I think one thing I've done before is think through some of those generic questions that you might be asked in an interview. You know, why did you apply for this job? Why are you interested? And think through, okay, if I was asked this question, what would I say? What would I tell someone face to face? And then, you know, after you say that, you talk for 2 or 3 minutes, check your resume. Is what you said actually on your resume? Because I have been in interviews, probably done interviews where I have said things that I know, I forgot to put that on my resume, but I have done this. Or I've been sitting in interviews and someone has just told a great story about these experiences that they've had. And I look at their resume and I think, well, where was that? Where was that in the resume? Stephen.
Yeah, conversely, I would say that you should also know what's on your resume. I know that when I sat on panels for interviews, we would bring up a point on someone's resume and they would just blank and not know what we were talking about sometimes. And that was always kind of like was it true then or not? And it would really cast doubt onto, you know, the veracity of their resume itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So thoughts on using full sentences versus itemization in experience descriptions. Julia, do you want to elaborate a little bit on the question for everybody before we address it, or? Yeah, that's good.
Sure. Well, I can elaborate, but I'm trying to be as clear as I could in my question. So I've had experience with some resumes being requested to have full sentence descriptions, whereas others find that cumbersome, and the resume reader would enjoy just being able to see the bullet points of it, and if they want more information, they can clarify it themselves, and the full sentence is just taking up space that could be used for more relevant or targeted bullet points. Hopefully my question is clear.
No, I think it's clear. I'm curious thank you, Juliet. I'm curious if there's thoughts in the experience of resume writers and reviewers that we have on this call.
I can share my experience writing a resume for Peace Corps and a cover letter. It was I don't know, maybe almost a year ago when I applied. So basically what I did, and it got me a job. I wrote first what's my current experience, and I explained that a little bit in a detail, like maybe a few sentences. my last working experience. Other experiences I enlisted, you know, like from which point to which point I worked, where I worked, and what was my duty. So it was pretty, those things were short. So that gave opportunity for the interviewer, if I get an interview, to ask me more if they want to. But what I was working for the Ministry of Defense for 10 years, and my last duties and obligations I explain in a small passage. It wasn't too long. I also put bullet points for my, you know, education, things like that. And in the end, I emphasized my skill regarding language, computer knowledge, and organizational skills, and all things that I did throughout my career, which I thought were useful for Peace Corps. So in my resume, I put something that I thought would be of use for them to see, okay, so this experience, we can gain something from this. On the cover letter, I actually just went through all my working and educational experience, speaking of it through a Peace Corps eyes. Like, you need this, I have this, you need this, I have this, you need this, I have this. But it was more of a story, you know, storytelling. So it was kind of a, from the beginning till the end, telling them what I did, which matched my resume, you know, but now telling as a storytelling and saying like, well, this experience is of use because of this, this, and this, and this is because of this. And then I had experience in volunteering and this and that. And in the end, I wrote, and I hope, you know, I wrote about my passion and willingness to learn and to have new experiences. And then I wrote that I hope that all of my previous experience recommends me for an interview. That is how I basically ended. And I wrote sincerely and signed it. I think it's a nice thing to do, to sign your, you know, cover letter. That's it.
Hi,
Thank you, Ivana. Yes, thank you, Ivana. Ivana was clearly successful in her process to work for Peace Corps. So very salient examples. Go ahead, Marie, please.
thanks, Ivana. I wanted to share, because the resumes for, like, if you're applying to an NGO or private sector, the page is limited, and the most it could be is like 2 pages, but maximizing it to 1 page is really good. And in the sentences, trying to really use words that resonate, like not using maybe a series of 3 words that kind of convey the same spirit, but just finding the right word where you're really letting the person who's reading the resume know your skill and what you're bringing, and trying in that same sentence to show, like highlighting what you did and what was the result, like quickly in a 1-sentence phrase that would really capture their attention, so that when you do go to the interview, they're interested to learn more about that sentence you wrote on your resume, so that you leave some level of like some curiosity. This is why they're going to call you to the interview, when they read the 1 bullet sentence. So you don't want to say everything, but enough to capture their attention and know that why you're qualified for the position and what you can bring to that position, but leaving some something that where you can say more about this bullet point when you go to the interview. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Marie. And I think as we're having this conversation, and you know, this resume that we have up here on the screen, I think is a really good example of formatting. But even as I read through it, as I